Hi everyone, Dr. Hall here. And so far we have talked about the non-sexually transmitted GU infections, infections of the skin, the urinary tract, the urethra, the epididymis, and the vagina. And now we're going to transition into talking about sexually transmitted infections. So this fourth part of the lecture is an introduction, so some general concepts that apply to all sexually transmitted infections. So first of all, we have to ask ourselves what makes something a sexually transmitted infection. And so a little note here, you'll see that I use the term STI, sexually transmitted infection. Many public health agencies still use the older term STD for sexually transmitted disease. But they mean the same exact thing. So STI is the same thing as STD. So you would think that this is obvious, is that what makes something an STI is that it is transmitted by sexual contact. But I want us to take a moment to really think about that and make sure that you realize that, because data shows that a lot of young Americans are kind of uninformed and are worried that they could maybe catch HIV from a hug, for example, or from just being friends with someone, or from holding hands. And so I think it's really important for us to talk about the fact that sexually transmitted infections are only transmitted sexually. So that requires a high degree of intimate contact, right? So either you have to be rubbing very intimate bits of yourself against intimate bits of somebody else, or putting them inside of somebody else, or having somebody else put their body parts inside of you. So sexually transmitted infections require very close intimate contact. So this also means, right, that it can't be transmitted by casual contact. So sneezing or shaking hands or coughing, right, like most infections that we're used to, right? So the cold viruses or influenza or coronavirus, those things are caused by this casual contact. They are relatively robust organisms, right? They can survive out in the air. They can survive on inanimate objects called fomites, right? They can survive on surfaces for a period of time. But the sexually transmitted infections can't. They are relatively wimpy bacteria and viruses. They need to pretty much be directly inoculated, directly transmitted from one body fluid of one person to the body fluid of another person, or skin that is rubbing and on close contact. So you cannot catch these through casual contact, with very few exceptions, which I will point out to you. So they generally don't live in the environment or in animals, right? You cannot catch herpes from your dog. So they are very specific, and they require this intimate contact. You can't get them from a toilet seat, for example. They have to be from person to person. The other thing that's important about STI is that it's a little bit counterintuitive, is that the symptoms are not always in the places where you actually caught the infection. So you would think if this is something that you got from having sex and you own a vagina, that your symptoms would be in the vagina. Well, they might be, but they might not, depending on the type of infection. In fact, some sexually transmitted infections, such as chlamydia, often have no symptoms at all, right? Which is kind of scary to contemplate, right? But so smart for the bacteria, right? If you don't have any symptoms, you don't know you have it, you'll keep having unprotected sex, perhaps with lots of people, and the bacterium gets to be spread throughout the population. You may have genital symptoms, so some of the infections definitely cause symptoms where you got them. Or sometimes they can actually spread from the genital region or wherever you contracted them to other parts of the body. So sometimes you can have symptoms on your skin that's not near the genitals, or in your brain, right? So depending on the particular infectious agent, you can have symptoms either on the genital region, elsewhere in the body, or no symptoms at all. So it's also to think about what determines your risk of a sexually transmitted infection. So as we've just discussed, they require close, intimate contact of your body or body fluids with another person's body or body fluids. So obviously that sexual activity is going to be kind of a prerequisite for getting these STIs. But once you're sexually active, it also depends on what exactly you are doing. So what body parts are you putting where? Because depending on the infection and depending where you or the other person may or may not have the infection, you might be at higher or lower risk, right? So if you're just kissing someone, that's a very different risk from having vaginal or anal intercourse, right? So there's lots of different risk levels depending on which specific behaviors you are engaging in, and we'll talk about those for each infection as we go through. The other is how are you doing it? So namely, are you practicing safer sex or not? So are you using condoms, which is our kind of primary protective tool for sexual activity. It doesn't work for all circumstances and all situations, nor for all types of behaviors. So dental dams and other things can be used for oral sex. We'll talk a little bit about that, but certainly if you're using a barrier, that will significantly reduce your risk of many of these infections. Again, we'll talk about that in detail for each one. And then the last one depends on with whom you are doing it. So first of all, have you only ever had one partner or have you had multiple partners, right? So the more partners you have, the higher statistical probability that you might come into contact with an STI. Now, it doesn't mean that you couldn't have 20 partners and never get infected, and your friend could have one partner and get infected, right? There's a lot of just kind of luck and probability here. It also depends on whether the people with whom you're partnering are themselves more statistically likely or unlikely to have an infection. So that depends on their past behaviors, whether they've practiced safer sex, and with how many partners have they had in the past, right? So it's kind of a numbers game. The other thing that's important, and this is often not stressed and we need to understand, is the community prevalence of STIs, meaning how common is it for people in that particular community to have an infection? And that's actually going to have a high impact on your personal risk. So to illustrate this concept, I've got two different communities here. I've got two different groups of people. So I have the gray circles and I have the brown circles. So both of these communities of people are about to engage in unprotected intercourse with each other, okay? But what we're going to see is that things are going to evolve differently depending on the baseline community prevalence. So to start with, let's say that there is one person to start with over here in the community on the right who has an infection. So I've kind of tinted them that pinkish reddish color. So we have at baseline one person infected out of 15. What's going to happen now is imagine that each one of these people has sex with one other person. In the community on the left, nobody has this infection, so nobody's going to catch the infection. But in the community on the right, now we have two people who have the infection, so it's doubled. Let's say that now everybody in each community is going to have a second partner, right? So now they're going to have a second partner. So we can see that now each of those two people who were infected have infected two additional people. So now we've gone up to 4 infected people in the community on the right. And now let's go ahead and have a third sexual partner, someone new. And wow, so now we are up to 8 infected people in the community on the right and still no infected people in the community on the left. Now, the reason why I show this to you is because the people in the community on the left were having just as much unsafe sex as the people in the community on the right, right? There was nothing about their individual behaviors that was any different. They just happened to be lucky that there wasn't any of this particular infection in their community. So therefore, they were very unlikely or unable to encounter it and get infected with it. The people in the community on the right were unlucky likely that there was some of this infection in their community. So in this example, you either had some infection in your community or none, but as you can imagine, that's not usually the case. Usually there's at least a little bit in every community, but the differences can then have a profound impact, right? So if you start off with 5% of your population having an infection versus 1%, then how things build from there is going to be very different because we see this exponential rise that can occur. So we also talk about the number of partners. So we're going to come back to community prevalence in a moment. You may have seen a chart like this. So it says, you know, if you've only ever had one partner and they've only ever had one partner, right? So if every person has only had the same number of partners as you, then you've only been exposed to one person. But if you have had two partners, and each of your two partners has had two partners, one of them being you, then you've been exposed potentially to 3 people, right? And so on, right? So by the time you've had, you know, 10 partners in your life, if each of those partners had had 9 partners previous to you, you've potentially been exposed to over 1,000 people. So, you know, I'm not showing this to scare you because this is just kind of one of the facts of life. And of course, usually if you've had 10 partners, some of the people that you partnered with had 9 partners before you and some of them didn't, right? So so it's usually not kind of this big. And this also assumes that these people were all asymptomatic, they never got tested, they never got treated, right? So so don't freak out if you've had a lot of partners. That can still be just fine, as long as people are practicing safer sex and getting tested and treated when necessary. But so certainly just from a probabilistic standpoint, right, just from probability, just sheer numbers game, the more partners you have, the more likelihood, and the more partners that they have had, the higher likelihood you could get infected. Right, so it's just a statistical likelihood, but of course not all partners are the same, right? Their prior behaviors matter, and whether they're being truthful with you about their prior behaviors matters, okay? So if then you have sex with someone who's had several previous partners and hasn't used condoms consistently, your risk is going to depend in large part on the prevalence of STIs in that community, as we discussed. So when we think about community prevalence, as we saw, that community on the left, they were having just as much unsafe sex as the people on the right, but they didn't get infected, right? Because there just wasn't a lot of that particular infection in their community. And when we study sexually transmitted infections, what we'll find is that there are certain communities that have higher prevalence, which means they have higher likelihood of getting infected despite not engaging in any riskier behaviors than anybody else. And so when we think about communities, they can certainly be geographic, right? The community of Menominee, Wisconsin, for example, or they could be based on your workplace or your school, right? People who go to Stout versus people who go to UW Eau Claire or UW River Falls, right? You tend to date and have sex with people who are part of your community. And so your school community is just only one community of which you're a part, right? Maybe you're an athlete, right? And so maybe you're part of that community. Maybe you're part of a fraternity. Maybe you're part of Greek life. Maybe you're kind of a geeky person and you spend a lot of time with other people who identify as geeks. Or maybe you're part of the queer community and you tend to socialize with and date other people in the queer community. Perhaps you associate with other people of similar race and ethnicity or from a similar religious group. So we all have multiple different types of communities to which we belong, and we are more likely to have intimate relationships with people who are part of some of those communities, because that's how you meet people often. And so depending on what the prevalence in your community is, that's going to have a high impact on your risk of infection. So when we look at data on STIs as we go through them, you will find that there are often some communities that are disproportionately affected, that have much higher rates of certain STIs than other communities. For some STIs, it's people who live in the South, the southern United States. For some, it's people who live in urban areas. Sometimes the Black community or African Americans are disproportionately affected. young adults almost always, right? So most STIs occur in people in their 20s, in their teens and 20s, right? So just by your virtue of your age and the community of your age peers, you are at increased risk. And certainly the queer community, particularly men who have sex with men, have a higher community prevalence of several sexually transmitted infections, and we'll talk about why. But it's really important to realize that just because a certain group has a higher prevalence, it doesn't mean that they are dirty or they are having riskier or more unprotected sex than other communities, right? They might be, but they might not, right? And so the problem is once your community prevalence is high, your overall risk of getting infected is much higher, even if your individual behavior is the same as somebody in another community. So our introduction to STIs, remember, they require direct intimate contact to be transmitted. You cannot casually transmit an STI to somebody else, with very few exceptions. And the factors that influence your risk are what you do, basically what body parts you put where, or what fluids you allow to get where. How you do it, basically, are you using condoms or other protective measures or not? Are you having safer sex? The number of partners you've had, just because it's a numbers game, it's a probability issue, and your community prevalence, because that is going to impact your overall risk or likelihood of coming into contact with an infection. So that is our introduction, and then lecture 24, we'll start off by diving into some of the different STIs. Lecture 24, we'll talk about parasites and bacterial sexually transmitted infections.